Okay, you're live.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. We will start in a couple of minutes. We still have lots of people coming in, so we will give people a minute or two more to join.
Okay, you're live.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. We will start in a couple of minutes. We still have lots. Okay, sorry about that. Can everyone hear me properly? Carlos says there was some problem with my audio.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good. Okay, I think people have stopped coming in very great numbers. May I request Linda and Paul to please keep an eye on the waiting room and admit people as they come in. If everything is fine, we can start. I'm really glad to see that there are so many people here today. I'm seeing about almost 120 people, which is great. So let's get going. What sense are we to make of the stunning collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria over the last several weeks? Certainly, we do not assume, as Western governments and media would have us believe, that we are witnessing the dawn of democracy in Syria. No matter what we may think of Assad's government, while a few may argue that while few will argue that it was a paragon of democratic virtue, it is not difficult to imagine that many may wax nostalgic about its real, if limited, virtues in coming months and years, if things go downhill from here. Much has happened in the aftermath of the fall of other governments changed by the West, essentially in regime change operations, whether of Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi, which has led to such a reaction. But then do we assume that what has happened represents the triumph of the West, the United States and Israel? There is much evidence to support this assumption. However, there may also be a third interpretation. It's possible that even after all the blood and treasure that has been poured into this situation, and the blood, of course, has been mostly that of Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, and other such nationalities, the US and Israel may yet not get what they want. No doubt these lines of analysis do not exhaust the interpretive possibilities, and that is why we need this webinar. So thank you all for joining this webinar, which is organized by the International Manifesto Group. I'd like also to thank Paul Graham, who is our videographer, Eklavia, who is our transcriber, Carlos Martinez and Keith Bennett, Linda Christian, and Alan Freeman, who are members of our events committee, who put all these events up. And of course, thank all the speakers. Unfortunately, perhaps partly because of the holiday season, or perhaps not, but we've had a couple of cancellations. Professor Dimitri Trenin and Vanessa Beeley cannot be with us, and their presence will, of course, we will miss them terribly. But at the same time, we still have some excellent speakers, and we are going to start with them. So I think, first of all, we will have Amar Waqaf. Amar is not able to be with us physically, but he has sent us a recording, which we will play for you. Amar Waqaf is the founder and director of Gnosos, or at the Gnosos View, an organization expressing stakeholder opinion in Syria and the Middle East. And so maybe it would be best if we just begin by listening to his recorded message. So let me see if I can play it for you. Give me just 1 second. First of all, let me share the screen. Share this, share, and then play it. So here goes. And please let me know if there is any problem hearing him or any other problem.
First of all, thank you for having me. I regret not being able to do it live. The collapse of the Syrian army has taken everyone by surprise. The Syrian army, the way I understand it, is or had been pretty much focused on the southern areas, the southern front, in preparation for any potential or possible spillover from the war that had been going on or has been going on for more than a year now in Palestine and in southern Lebanon, especially after the southern Lebanon war started. We understand that there were more reinforcements sent south, probably to give the impression that the Syrian army is ready and allow the Israeli army to think twice or force them to think twice before making any adventures towards Damascus. This meant, if true, which I believe it is, this meant that the Syrian army up north on the Aleppo front was a little bit depleted. There were voids and so on. After the ceasefire was announced in Lebanon, early morning or Tuesday night, the Syrian president, who is the commander-in-chief of the Syrian army, took the opportunity to fly to Moscow. His wife is there. She's been treated. She has been treated for cancer for a while now. Probably visit her a little bit. There are also rumors about his son doing his master's degree presentation or whatever. So he probably saw fit to take a quick trip to Moscow. This coincided immediately with an offensive by Jabhat al-Nusra towards the army posts west of Aleppo. The commander-in-chief was absent. His trip to Moscow, which was pre-scheduled sort of, to be taken immediately after ceasefire, was known to those who planned the attack. And so they wanted maximum impact. Apparently, the theory was that they could take Aleppo before he could do something or anything about it. Because reinforcements, should they be sent from the south northwards, they would take time to arrive. And
Paul, sorry, Carlos, would you like to share it, please? I'm sorry, the audio is not good, but you go ahead and share it, please. I will make you co-host. Sorry, 1 second. So, you are now co-host. Would you like to share it instead?
Yeah, 1 sec. Let me just find it.
First of all, thank you for having me. I regret not being able to do it live. The collapse of the Syrian army has taken everyone by surprise. The Syrian army, the way I understand it, is or had been pretty much focused on the southern areas, the southern front, in preparation for any potential or possible spillover from the war that had been going on or has been going on for more than a year now in Palestine and in southern Lebanon, especially after the southern Lebanon war started. We understand that there were more reinforcements sent south, probably to give the impression that the Syrian army is ready and allow the Israeli army to think twice or force them to think twice before making any adventures towards Damascus. This meant, if true, which I believe it is, this meant that the Syrian army up north on the Aleppo front was a little bit depleted. There were voids and so on. After the ceasefire was announced in Lebanon on Wednesday early morning or Tuesday night, the Syrian president, who is the commander-in-chief of the Syrian army, took the opportunity to fly to Moscow. His wife was there. She's been treated. She has been treated for cancer for a while now. Probably visit her a little bit. There are also rumors about his son doing his master's degree presentation or whatever. So he probably saw fit to take a quick trip to Moscow. This coincided immediately with an offensive by Jabhat al-Nusra towards the army posts west of Aleppo. The commander-in-chief was absent. Probably his trip to Moscow, which was pre-scheduled sort of, to be taken immediately after ceasefire, was known to those who planned the attack, and so they wanted maximum impact. And apparently the theory was that they could take Aleppo before he could do something or anything about it. Because reinforcements, should they be sent from the south northwards, they would take time to arrive, and it would be a battle lost anyway. And that would be in preparation for putting more pressure on the Syrian government to concede on multiple fronts. We understand that the sponsor of this attack has always been Turkey, but then there is the United States, there is Israel, who all have benefit and who may also have shared some resources, some assets, intelligence assets, security assets on the ground who would facilitate the breakdown of the Syrian army. I.e. probably command information or wrong information being sent upwards, or deformed decisions or orders being sent downwards to the front. Anyway, Aleppo fell, and President Assad just waited in Moscow, apparently a little bit more, so that he could meet with President Putin of Russia, who wasn't there, who was in Astana in Kazakhstan attending some business. And he flew back to Moscow on Friday, and then they met, and they probably decided that they could mount some defense line near Hama. This is the third day. President Assad returned to Syria. The defense line was formed. The Syrian army started conducting battle, and they managed to repel a swarm of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But apparently at the time there were negotiations taking place, and how I understand things happened is that he was put, i.e. President Assad or former President Assad, was put under a choice. You could mount a defense here, we could help you, i.e. the Russians, the Iranians, either on the ground or in the sky. And then you can mount a defense, you could stop the rebels, perhaps also with the right reinforcements, you could take back Aleppo, you could take back Idlib, but hey, the war is not going to end, and those people probably don't want you back, and so your best option probably is to stay where you are, which would lead 2, 3, 4 years down the line to Syria disintegrating into different states or mini states or so on. So why don't you, probably this was a Turkish suggestion, why don't you just call it a day? You've been in power for 24, 25 years, and let the people decide what next. And probably he asked for some guarantees that no large-scale massacres would take place, no large-scale revenge would take place, and probably the Turkish president felt he could provide such a guarantee. And what was expected from a late president was to provide an orderly retreat of the Syrian army without a fight, which is exactly what happened. Meanwhile, or on the last day in Doha, the parties met, the Astana parties met to provide some polish to the agreement, and this was supported by Arab states who apparently vowed to bankroll the transitional period and let the Syrian people feel better about, or less worried about, the transitional period. Now, this is what we think happened. It was a quick collapse. This is the best scenario in which we think the former president thought about. There are other scenarios where he could probably said, you haven't been supported enough by those allies. Let's just
let them deal with it or whatever. In terms of what is going on is that the HTS probably didn't expect to reach Damascus, or that wasn't the plan, but this is exactly how it turned out. Now they are faced with the task of running the entire country, which everyone doubts that they would be able to. There are lots of worries amongst normal citizens. There has been yesterday a big demonstration in Damascus about freedoms, about liberties and the right of women and so on. And these are all challenges for the new de facto leaders of Syria. Obviously, the economy is in tatters and they would be heavily dependent, or the new Syrian state would be heavily dependent, at least in the for a start, on foreign aid, on all countries pushing towards the same direction. Probably most importantly, the regional states, i.e. Arab states plus Turkey, providing Israel doesn't do a lot of disruption, which obviously it already has. And yeah, they would go if they do not relinquish power within a very short period and allow a more representative interim government to take place, then they would be squeezed and people would rise against them. So what we think is going to happen is that they're going to be part of a more or a wider coalition of forces representing all Syrians, so to speak. And that, well, the plan is at least, is that government, under the auspices of Security Council 2254, would be called the transitional government or the transitional body. And that transitional body that is representative of all Syrians would pave the way for a new constitution and then a new elections from which a new government or a new Syria would emerge. So that's the plan. Now, there are so many challenges. There are so many acts of revenge that are taking place in the streets and so on. So we don't know how solid the upcoming period is going to be, but if all major players who have currently stake in Syria, if we take out Russia and Iran, who don't seem to be having much influence at this moment in time, nor probably in the near future, then all those states like the Turks, the Americans, the Arab allies, the US Arab allies are all pulling in the same direction, and hopefully we won't see something like what happened in Libya when, for example, the UAE and Qatar chose to provide support for competing factions, and this led to endless wars and so on. So, you could take all this with a pinch of salt, but this is at least the hope. It could go definitely worse than that, and it's so fragile. But we understand as well that the Turks are providing a lot of support on governance on the ground to HTS, which is, yeah, you might argue this is for intervention, but it's far more acceptable than people would realize, because at least this is a state that can advise on how to reduce tension as much as possible. On the regional front and international front, the situation is completely turned upside down. Prior to this battle in Syria, the axis of resistance had reached a point where it was pushing Israel towards conceding for the very first time in its history, because they haven't been able, even though they put a lot of armor and bombs into it, to achieve a decisive victory over their adversaries, i.e. Hamas and Hezbollah, who are still fighting. They're still in the game. But the collapse of Syria has really deprived the axis of resistance of its let's just say heart and soul. A lot of things have changed. People do not think about what is going on in Palestine anymore, at least in the public opinion mind. If Israel bombs in Gaza, is that news even to bring on the BBC, for example? I don't think so. It's all about Syria. It's all about the rebels beating the government and making, all these heinous crimes like the Sednaya prison and some, as rumored, some public graves or whatever, mass graves go into the open. So everybody's talking about that, and there is hope about democracy in Syria and all the challenges. So the Palestinian cause, prior to this battle, had been firmly put on the table, with the Palestinian statehood pretty much on the cards, the two-state solution. Everybody was thinking about it, how are we going to deal with it. Suddenly, all that, I wouldn't say in the bin, but at least it's not a priority anymore. What is priority is to get Syria stabilized. Israel pretty much is the biggest winner of all this on a regional scale. Russia has lost severely. I'm not sure a lot of people would want to count on Russia from now on as an ally. They failed. Basically, they're out of the Middle East. I'm not so sure how they're going to go back into the Middle East. Probably compensated a little bit in the Ukraine, but it's in the Middle East. Nobody's going to think, I'm putting my eggs in the Russia basket anymore. Iran, they had this regional structure from which they exerted influence towards their own interests and everybody else's interests. That thing is pretty much broken at this moment in time, and we don't know how they're going to recover. And you never know. People in Iran might start asking questions. Okay, well, you had the axis of resistance theory for a while now, and we've been deprived of a lot of our resources to fund that. That has now collapsed. Could you please bring us bread and so on? So it may go domestic a little bit in Iran, but definitely on the regional scale, their influence has really been shortened. But this is early days. We don't know how things are going to develop. And the core issue of the Middle East is still there, which is the Palestinian issue and their grievance, and it has to be solved. And if it doesn't get solved, then it will brew violence and instability in the region in the days to come, that's for sure.
Thanks for that, Carlos. I hope everyone can hear me now. Yes, so we are now going to go to our next speaker. So just so everybody knows, first of all, we will have all the speakers. The speakers will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes each, and then we do intend to have a question and answer session. So the next speaker will be Ali Al-Assam. And Ali.
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, Ali. Hello, yes.
I'll share my presentation.
Yeah, Ali, let me just introduce you very briefly. Ali is the managing director of the News Social Cooperative, and he's also a member of the Friends of Socialist China Britain Committee. So Ali, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This presentation is originally was done by my colleague Sami Al-Banna. Let me minimize this. And then we discussed our Mushtarak platform, and I added something to it. So really, we see that the fall of Damascus as part of the geopolitical struggle in West Asia. We see it very much as part of this struggle. So I'm going to talk about this West Asia struggle in my presentation. So if we talk, there are two axes, of course. There is the US-Israeli axis with NATO behind it, and there is the axis of resistance. And I hope everybody can see the screen. So what are the shared strategic goals between the United States and Israel in this US-Israeli axis? We see it in terms of eliminating Hamas and Hezbollah as political actors in West Asia. Weakening Iran, especially its influence in the region, neutralizing the Arabic states, and demonstrating Zionist military superiority as the deterrence of Israel. And then the dismantling of Syria as a viable state. Not only is an Israeli scheme, but it's actually part of the scheme of the new cause in the US, what Condoleezza Rice always talked about, creating managed chaos in the Middle East. So it's the dismantlement of Syria is part of the schemes for Iraq, Libya, Iran, and even Turkey. These are the shared strategic goals of the US and Israel, the way they are moving very fast to trying to achieve it. But actually, there is something else. It is part of the US aim of encircling China by hegemony in the West Asia. The US sees the best part of meeting the China challenge is really by controlling the sea routes, the sources of energy, and the routes of energy in West Asia. And this is really a paramount objective of the US policy in West Asia and what's happening in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine and elsewhere. But what are the Israeli goals? So there are particular Israeli goals. Israel has developed as a monster with genocide, with apartheid, and with fascist Zionist ideology really developing very quickly. But what the Israeli wants in particular is to remove most Palestinians from Palestine. They want to end this Palestine resistance. They want to end Palestine national aspirations. They want to demonstrate military and technological superiority to cow the Arabs into submitting for what they call it the Abraham Accord. And they want to create the new Middle East where Israel is dominant. This is really Israel's main drive in the area to create a Middle East completely dominated by it. And to do that, they have to eliminate Iran. This is not particularly is the US interest. The US wants to weaken Iran, but not necessarily to destroy Iran. But the Israel is pushing the US, contrary to US own interest, for direct confrontation with Iran. So there is in this is axis, there is a US interest and Israeli interest. They coincide because Israel is spearheading US policy in the Middle East. But there are also areas of difference. So really, what does, in terms of this struggle, what does the loss of Syria mean as part of the resistance bloc? The resistance bloc has lost a key member that formed strategically a vital position along the border of occupied Palestinian territories. That's one big loss. There's also the looming threat of encirclement of the Lebanese resistance through the Syrian-Lebanese border. And there is the potential disintegration of Syria, that great country with a great history, with great people, with the profound consequences for its people and profound consequences for the neighboring countries. And also, we have the potential resistance. Ammar talked about demonstrations in Damascus yesterday, and there were demonstrations in the south against Israeli occupation. So, but this is the beginning of what we see. There is the looming threat of dismemberment of Syria, but also there is a potential for resistance. And it is in terms of what are the factors behind this sudden disintegration of the Syrian army and all this big loss. There is a lot of analysis to be done. The Syrian regime is one of the latest of the nationalist regime that gained power in the 50s. So we are seeing a new historical period, really. But also there was a massive hostile preparations by Turkey, the US, Israel, and the West for the last many months, which resulted in this sudden attack. And even when these jihadis were attacking Damascus, there was an air cover by Israel. So it was a big thing. But still, we must remember, a fortress can only fall from within. There must have been some inherent weaknesses in the Syrian regime, in the Syrian army, that resulted in this sudden loss. And this must be analyzed. And this must be compared to the fantastic resistance by Hezbollah, for example, against Israeli attack despite the loss of its leadership. So one must study that. But I don't have the time to discuss it, and probably don't have the time to discuss it. But it's good to discuss it at one stage. Now, regarding the BRICS Plus countries, it's been a geopolitical blow to Russia, Iran, and China, to all of them. Russia is set to lose its naval base, although it might be substituted by another one in Algeria. China has lost a Belt and Road Initiative strategic agreement with Syria, and the US has been extremely aggressive in the last 2 years, in particular, both in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, to prevent China from progressing on its Belt and Road Initiative. And so it will be very difficult to see China going back for any meaningful relation with the Syrian regime, particularly because the Soviet and Israel, because of the U.S. and Israeli influence on the new regime in Syria, or their pressure on it. And Iran, it will probably refer to the nuclear option to increase its defenses, and an alliance with Russia, which might happen on the 25th of this month or next month, which will be of strategic importance and will be very significant, this new agreement between Iran and Russia. So this is the effect from the BRICS plus countries. Now, having talked about the big strategic loss of Syria, let's talk now about the winners and losers in West Asia from the 7th of October 2023 until now. So I'm just going to go through the winners and losers for both. First of all, Iran and the resistance bloc. We have to put the loss of Syria in perspective, really. So there has been an effective and precise missile strikes penetrating Israel, American, British, and other defenses. Israel, NATO, and the US put everything they can against Iranian missile strikes on Israel, and they couldn't stop it. This is really of strategic military significance that cannot be ignored. Also, they could not stop a lot of the Hezbollah missiles on the last Sunday before the ceasefire. So this is one big factor that cannot be ignored. We are seeing Iran's military powers increasing and cohesive, and the government becoming more cohesive and growing stronger. And there is the possibility that will require a nuclear power. And we're seeing the emergence of Yemen, who blocked the Red Sea. I mean, only this morning there was a hypersonic missile that hit Tel Aviv. They can't stop it. Yemen have blocked the Red Sea and have challenged American naval presence in there. That cannot be ignored. But also we see on the negative side, we see the loss of Hassan Nasrallah, a great strategic leader that emerged once every few hundred years. His loss is a really big loss. But against that, we should see the miracle of Hezbollah, when, despite the death of Hassan Nasrallah and the top line 1 and line 2 of Hezbollah leadership and 4,000 of its cadres through the pager thing, they resisted 60 days of 70,000 soldiers Israeli attack with NATO behind it, who couldn't penetrate even for 2 kilometers. This is a miracle. And this miracle actually must be studied, because it refers to an ecosystem of resistance in Lebanon that was created by Nasrallah, and this is not going to disappear. And there are so many lessons that the global resistance movement and the liberation movement can learn from it. I truly call it a miracle. And then there is the loss of Syria, which is, as I said, it's a big strategic blow. But so there is big wins and there is a big loss. So, and then we go to the next one, to the other axis, the USA and Israel. There has been a success of security strikes. Absolutely. They managed to eliminate the leadership of Hezbollah and using the pager and so on. So Israel proved itself to be superb in security. But actually, it lost its deterrence. The Iron Dome is no longer. It could not stop the Iranian missiles or the Hezbollah missiles. And even other domes that the US wheeled into Israel could not stop it. So there is a failure of this deterrence. And there is a failure of ground offensive. Hamas is still fighting. And in Lebanon, it was an utter disaster for the Israeli army in there, and they were forced to accept a ceasefire. So the Israeli army, the core of the Israeli society, because Israeli society actually is a settlement society based on an army, and when the army is weak, there's danger going forward. So there's this one, but there is the geopolitical success in the fall of Syria. But the main powers in Syria will be Turkey and Qatar, especially Turkey, and we are seeing already a conflict between Turkey and the US over the Kurdish state. And then there is a big loss of the isolation of Israel as an apartheid state committing genocide. This is a big loss for Israel. So what is the balance? What is the balance with after all these struggles? And we are still going. The outcome, in my view, is that Iran and the resistance bloc has won on points, and Israel lost its strategic superiority. Without Israeli complete superiority in the Middle East and its deterrence, they cannot control the Middle East and West Asia. And Israel has lost that. But it's a very vicious struggle because we are seeing a superpower who is losing its dominance. We are seeing, and it's going to be vicious. And we are seeing Israel, who cannot defeat the Palestinian, is going to be even more fascist and more genocidal. So it's really lots of miseries for the people. And I just like to remind our audience, because we are all sad about the loss of Syria, but let's remember, compare this and with this outcome and compare it with 1982. And a lot of us remember that. 1982, Israel occupies Beirut. America and France put soldiers on the ground in Lebanon. And Saddam Hussein is busy fighting Iran, which lost 1 million of his soldiers, using chemical weapons supplied by the West then. That's 1982. And having Egypt and Jordan signing a peace agreement with Israel and be completely docile. So that was 1982, and that's the position now, as I showed to you. But it's a very vicious struggle. And of course, that's only on West Asia. Globally, Russia is much stronger, winning in Ukraine. And China, of course, is that huge technological economic power with the BRICS plus countries. So we have a different world from what it was in 1982. The curve is certainly on the up, but the curve goes up and down. And Syria's loss is one loss, but things do not keep still, as it didn't keep still after 1982. And we are seeing already a lot of signs of new struggles in Syria. And thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Radhika here. First of all, thank you very much, Ali. But since my audio is not working very well, I have requested Carlos Martinez to take over the chairing of this meeting, and Carlos has kindly agreed. So, Carlos, please take over.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Although, has to be said, your last sentence was absolutely perfect. So you can feel free to take the chairing back whenever you feel that's appropriate. So the next speaker is going to be Bahman Azad. Bahman is an Iranian-American peace activist who's been involved in the struggle for peace and justice in the US and around the world since the 1970s. He is a former professor of sociology and economics, a representative of the World Peace Council at the United Nations, and a member of the Administrative Committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. Please go ahead, Bahman.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank to International Manifesto Group for inviting me to speak at this very distinguished panel. I really enjoyed this speak by our friends, especially my brother Ali, who gave a comprehensive view of the whole situation, with most of which, except very minor points, I didn't agree with. I did agree. And I would like to, instead of going through reviewing the whole situation, I would like to take a kind of a little bit challenging position and try to warn against some misinterpretations of the situation in the Middle East. The first thing, of course, is the quick collapse of the Syrian government, which has started a whole campaign internationally, I would say, by the forces of imperialism and Israel to present this as a revolution in Syria, blame it on Assad dictatorship, the fact that the argument that he had become a neoliberal, tried to establish relations with Qatar and to connect with them, or even being an inept or incompetent dictatorship in the country because of all the poverty and everything that had existed. What these people who claim these positions do not consider is the fact that Syria has been under US sanctions since the Iranian Revolution. Syria, by taking side with Iran from 1979, kind of got the wrath of all Arab countries, Arab states, and at the same time became target of vicious sanctions by the United States for many years, decades. On top of it, you had this 10-year internal war conflict that was going on, that was depleting all of the energies of the state. And finally, you had this stealing, open stealing, the capturing of its oil fields, the stealing of the resources of the country by the United States military, choking the whole economy of the country. So when you bring this whole package together, the question becomes, how much choice or options did Assad have for running the country? So one thing that we should avoid, especially as international supporters of the movement toward the multipolar world, resistance against imperialism, we should not allow the Western media, Western propaganda redirect us toward blaming the victim of imperialism than imperialism itself and Zionism. So this is the first thing I would like to take as a challenge, that let us not fall in this trap of taking it and blaming it on Assad as if he was the one responsible for all the problems in Syria. We should not forget that part of the problems is not just limited to Syria. Many of the resisting countries are facing the same thing. If you can blame the blackouts in Cuba on Cuban government, you can blame Assad government for what problems there is there. Same with Venezuela, the same with Nicaragua. Look at all the whole, there's a global struggle going on, and Syria is only one part of it. And they have been ready, and Assad has been ready to pay the price for it. And he kept going until, I'll get to that. So it's neither a revolution nor a result of dictatorship, lack of democracy or anything. One thing that a lot of people emphasize with, which I warn them against, is that, oh, don't forget Assad's government was a secular government. Well, it was not ideologically necessarily secular. It was a diverse society that required some kind of secularism to maintain its cohesion. That is different from ideological secularism that the West is trying to impose on the Middle East. And we have to be careful about that. The second thing I would like to bring in as a challenge is the whole idea that this was a strategic defeat. I personally don't agree that this was a strategic defeat for Hezbollah, for axis of resistance, or Iran. The strategic objective, in line with the movement toward global transition to a multipolar world, was a long-term war of attrition, not a direct confrontation, military confrontation. That was not the objective. And that was not the strategy of Iran, nor the axis of resistance. If you look at the global process, the move toward a multipolar world has so many pieces in the puzzle that have to be put in place one by one through time, from economic side, from diplomatic side, from political side, from international agreements and pacts between countries, intercontinental relationships. These all have to happen for this process to be successful. And one of the main conditions for the progress or advancement of this process is to maintain some degree of tranquility and peace in the world. The opposite is for the imperialist camp. they cannot peacefully compete with this process and block it, as we have seen it. The only way they can block this process is to militarize the situation, to start wars, to move the whole confrontation to a military form of confrontation. That's where they are the strongest. They have nothing else. And the global movement, including China, Iran, and Russia, have been following this strategy from the beginning. I remember Ayatollah Khamenei several times mentioned that this is a long-term war of attrition, that we should bring Israel, even he said that, bring Israel to its knees economically. And if you see this whole process has started to do this and has already affected Israel that way. And that was a process. So what happened is that people of Palestine had every right to decide when to want to rise up. And they did. And they made tremendous victories, or achieved tremendous victories in this process. In the whole world, no longer Israel a victim is presented as a victim. No longer US is a pro-democracy for human rights element. The whole global public opinion has become aware of this. The world is rising against this whole imperialist, unipolar world, hegemonical world. So they have had positive impacts, but at the same time, inevitably, this put the axis of resistance on a military confrontation path, which was not where we are strongest at this time. May not be the case tomorrow, but at this time it wasn't. And if you look at the whole action-reaction between Iran, Israel, and axis of resistance, you will see that Iran hesitated in moving the whole confrontation to an all-out war in the Middle East, and Israel was trying to push it that way. And the reason I'm saying this is because we have to look at this process as one front in the whole global movement and not isolate it as if we have lost the whole battle. This is not the case. As Brother Ali also mentioned that the struggle continues. We have lost one front, and that is a military loss, not a social, not a political, not a revolutionary loss. I mean, the strategy of the axis of resistance was to free the West Asia and the Middle East from the hegemonic control of US and Israel. That was the strategy. It is still the strategy. Now, but what mean tactics and whatnot is a different story. The aim was not to win it militarily. There was no way we could do it at this stage. 10 years from now, 5 years from now, we may be able to do it, but not now. So this was something that the axis of resistance had to respond to. It wasn't a conscious strategic decision to get engaged in a direct military confrontation. But they had to defend Palestine, they had to defend Lebanon, they had to defend everybody, now that the process had started. They could not control the world events. Things happen. The whole World War I started with the assassination of one prince. You cannot stop the process once it's triggered. So that's the issue. So the question is for now, should we accept the strategic defeat? If we accept that, what would be our option? What is the new strategy that we could have? Stop resisting? That cannot be an option. The question is, and I think, and I close with this, that putting this whole thing in the context of global process, we have to understand that this I would call it conscious retreat. I wouldn't call it it was a huge military defeat, no question about it. I am not trying to diminish that. But at the same time, it was a conscious decision by the main players of the resistance to make a conscious retreat, to still keep the door open for non-military means of regaining. Put it on a political, diplomatic, social agenda. A lot of people think that the people of Syria are happy about this. I don't think so. I have been involved with the Syrian movement for a long time. I know when people stand and their kind of baffled silence is not a sign that they agree to it. As Brother Ali mentioned, huge demonstrations in Syria right now. People are coming back to understand what the situation is and respond to it. And also don't forget that for 15 years, Afghanistan was under the thumb of the United States. Iraq was invaded by the United States. Is Iraq and Afghanistan under the thumb of the United States today? I don't think so. I don't think Syrian fate will be different. There's so many divisions on top of the conspirators, US, Israel, NATO, Turkey. There are different objectives. With regard to Kurdish issue, only they could split several ways. Look at the forces that took over Damascus. 10, 15 different organizations of different religious orientation, different background, different ties to different countries. They're not going to last. Ultimately, the resistance will resurface. And we will be victorious in that. I seriously believe that. So let's not be disillusioned or disappointed with this. It's just a new phase in the struggle, the same struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bahman, for that very powerful and insightful presentation. And if you look in the Zoom chat, you'll see that people are extremely appreciative of your remarks. I was particularly glad that you brought up this issue of not pinning the blame for the collapse of the Syrian Arab Republic on issues of democracy versus authoritarianism and so on, because we're seeing a lot of that, not only in the imperialist media, but among our friends as well, also on the left, also within the anti-imperialist movement, talking about Bashar al-Assad as a dictator, as about Syria not having strong democratic institutions and so on. And it strikes me as being quite unhelpful. It reinforces an imperialist narrative and it shifts the blame, if you like, from perpetrator to victim. If you look at the geopolitical situation that Syria has faced for not just the last 13 years, but really the last 50 years, if you consider the political context it existed in, the ongoing siege, the fact that it has Israel as a neighbor, desperate to annex it, to balkanize it. If you consider that the US has been working nonstop for 50 years to weaken the country, and all these weapons that have been provided to these so-called rebel groups, they're provided by the CIA under the Timber Sycamore program. This is stuff that's very well known. Meanwhile, you've got Erdogan next door dreaming of reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. All the Arab regimes practically happy to coordinate with the US to destabilize Syria. A state under siege like that can hardly be a democratic utopia. So it's very important that we point the finger not at the Syrian government, but at the perpetrators, at the US, at Israel, at Britain, at the EU, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and whatnot. And, it's ironic that the imperialists hold up Zelensky by contrast as a great Democrat. Never mind the fact that he refuses to hold elections, that he bans left-wing parties, that he bans any expression of pro-Russian sentiment. By comparison, Syria under Bashar al-Assad was highly democratic. At least it held elections. It allowed and encouraged even political and religious and ethnic plurality. Communist parties were part of the government. The rights of minorities were protected, and so on. That was very insightful, very useful. Thank you so much, Bahman. I believe if Professor Morandi has arrived, I don't believe Professor Morandi has arrived yet, in which case I'm going to ask Sarah Flanders to give her presentation. Sarah is a long-standing political activist and author based in New York City, a contributing editor of Workers' World newspaper and a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition, the International Action Center, and the Sanctions Killed campaign. She's co-author and editor of numerous books, including Capitalism on a Ventilator, the Impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, and the recently released Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in the Global Economy. And I must give special thanks to Sarah, who is joining us on very short notice, i.e. about an hour. Vanessa Beeley was due to speak at this session today, but unfortunately, due to issues with her internet connection, she's had to pull out. So Sarah is taking her place. Please go ahead, Sarah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Radhika, and thank you to the International Manifesto for really today's presentation and really an effort to orient the political movement. I did do this on just a few minutes' notice, so my thoughts are really all not well prepared. I usually like to give a little bit more preparation, but I always take the position that it's look first at the US role and look at our responsibility in confronting imperialism at every step for this enormous crime today and really for the decades of ruin that they have brought on so many countries. I'll also just say a couple words that from the United National Anti-War Coalition, we very much wanted to tune in today to this, and we are planning a webinar next Saturday at 3 p.m. that will be entirely focused on the U.S. role, in this conspiracy, in this destruction, and the inability of the U.S. to put its plans into position anywhere in the world. So that's next Saturday at 3 p.m. and maybe a follow-up from this discussion. But let me say that there is international clarity in enormous millions and millions of people in motion in the streets on Gaza, on the West Bank, an understanding that it's totally funded and equipped, made possible by U.S. imperialism. And it continues because U.S. imperialism is in full support of every Zionist crime. This genocide would not be possible without U.S. funding and support. Knowing this, and it's the Democrats and the Republicans for decades, and it's despite global solidarity of historic proportions. But suddenly there is great confusion around Syria, and there are people who want us to forget everything that we know about the U.S. role in Palestine, Cuba, or Venezuela, or so many countries around the world. They want to try to cancel that. We can see this week in the most gruesome detail what the 60 years of war on Syria and the last 21 years of the most devastating sanctions on Syria. Now, I visited Syria at different times. Once, when it was a prosperous, modern country with zero foreign debt, free healthcare, free education, including universities, subsidized food, modern infrastructure, the oil resources, and the breadbasket was really for the whole population. And they were a strong defender, always, of Palestine and of Iran. What began to turn it? In 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, they imposed rounds of sanctions on neighboring Syria. It led to hyperinflation, shortages, the government workers, the soldiers, the teachers, the medical staff, suddenly their salaries were totally worthless. And that is fertile soil for a well-funded opposition that blames everything on the government, says it's corruption, and they never mention US sanctions. But we have to remember what the sanctions were doing all those years. And this exploded with US help and funding in 2011 in an uprising that was called the Arab Spring. We've seen these same tactics used in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and Venezuela, so many places around the world. And we have seen again and again US-funded mercenaries. This is not a new weapon. In Syria today, you see the HTS forces, which is really Al-Qaeda, ISIS. They've surged into Syria, all with US help and also help from Turkey, yes, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. But it's really an operation organized, initiated by the US to tear Syria apart and to accompany it with wild propaganda. Now, there was also, we need to remember, from 2014, there was years of US bombing, destroying so much of Syria's infrastructure, resulting in millions and millions of Syrian refugees, displacing more than half the population. The assistance and the solidarity of Hezbollah, of Iran, of Russia helped save Syria. At great cost, Syria regained control of its cities. But a third of Syria remained under US, Turkish control through these mercenary gangs. And this was the oil and resource-rich areas. This was the agricultural breadbasket. The US bases in Syria, still in Iraq to this day, in the Kurdish region, and the US trainers and contractors in Jordan, they operate together cohesively. Now, in Syria, there were years of no heat, little electricity, old weapons, and during that time, hundreds of bombing runs. And the bombing runs have continued even after the Syrian Arab Army was disbanded. Why? Why right now? The hundreds and hundreds of US and Israeli bombing runs. They say the government is defeated. The army is dissolved. And yet what's being destroyed is every conceivable part of the infrastructure in Syria today. Every industry, every possible form of military or economic or organizational resistance is being destroyed. None of this is for a free Syria. It's really for a US and Israeli occupied Syria, and it won't succeed. That's what we have to know, that what we need to do is to escalate our solidarity with all of the sanctioned countries. More than a third of the world population today is under US sanctions. More than 40 countries under US sanctions. And the pressure on these countries can be enormous. We got to know that the years and years of sanctions can have an impact and can cause a break in the lines. And for that, we don't blame those who resisted and who fought again and again to regain the control of their cities and to build a city that was truly a mosaic of many cultures, nationalities, and religions. We got to know the US plan to destabilize, not to rebuild. They have no plan to rebuild, just to spread a kind of a ruin. So for everyone who has supported, defended the resistance in Palestine, and I'm sure that's everyone on this audience and everyone we speak to, we have to do the same toward the resistance in Syria that will emerge. The US plans will fail, and I am very confident that Syria will rise because there's always, it's the one thing that's given, always resistance to repression, to occupation. We got to remember that US plans in Afghanistan, no conventional military there existed. In Iraq, they had totally decimated, shock and awe, every possible industrial center in Iraq, along with sanitation and sewage. Everything that a city needed to survive was destroyed. And that's what they want to destroy in Syria. And yet they couldn't hold Iraq. They couldn't hold it. And that it will be their fate in Syria. That the US effort at occupation, and they are occupying now by controlling the skies, by their bombing, and even the Israeli tanks that have entered into and grabbed greater part. This whole plan for greater Israel will fail. So I'll just sort of conclude on that. The US aim in this is it's aimed at China. Yes, it's aimed at Iran, but we got to know that the greater Israel plan will fail. I think the tasks of the anti-war movement is first to condemn this violent coup against an elected government and to know that the rebels can't hold their ground. The task of the anti-war movement has got to be determined solidarity with Iranian resistance that will emerge. And we got to refuse to all this negative speculation about who sold out, who didn't do enough. So much was done, and not every battle is won. So I'll just kind of end on that, also reminding people that Israel has yet to defeat this heroic resistance in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, where there's no army to defend the people. And they gained not 1 foot in Lebanon. So even though the impoverished and rather starved down Syrian Arab army, a conventional army, was not able to prevail against a very well-trained, we got to know the coordination, and a lot is coming out, the coordination of the US in preparation for this. This wasn't just a ragtag band that suddenly hit Aleppo. No, there was training in Jordan. There was new equipping also going on in Turkey and in US-held areas. Suddenly, very well-equipped forces arrived, and they overwhelmed. And I want to very much agree with Bauman's points on Syria's role and the role of sanctions. So let's take this as a time, a period for us to be confident that resistance will arise, that these pirates and looters who are partitioning Syria, it's part of a global struggle. And I'm sorry that these thoughts weren't more coherent. We'll try for next Saturday at 3 p.m. Tune in again. Thank you again to International Manifesto. And let's not engage in any of the blame of Syria for the resistance that they did put up. We got to always blame the US, the Zionist forces that are armed by the US, and all the imperialists who are cheering this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and please, no apologies. Your remarks were extremely coherent, as ever, very clear, and very principled and totally anti-imperialist. And it's so important what you said, about some of the gains, the social gains of the Syrian people that have been made over the last few decades in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, subsidies, and so on. These are things that were actually worth defending, and the coverage of it really reminds me of Libya before 2011. I mean, I don't see how people can fail to see that comparison even. We've got a country that genuinely shared the wealth deriving from its natural resources in order to provide free education, free healthcare, free housing, subsidized food, that had by far and away the highest human development index in Africa, the highest literacy rate in Africa. But Western propaganda hid all of that, slandered it as a basket case state, just as it slandered Syria. And of course, as you've brought up, in geopolitical terms, the Syrian Arab Republic was very much on our side of the global barricades, as a part of the axis of resistance. It was a defender of an emerging multipolar world. It was the frontline state that didn't capitulate to Israel. Egypt under Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel as far back as 1979, Jordan in 1994. Syria, on the contrary, positioned itself as a firm supporter of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance, certainly by far the most generous of the Arab states in its treatment of Palestinian refugees. It was really a part of this multipolar process. It had applied to join BRICS a couple of months ago. It signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative 2 years ago. People remember that Bashar al-Assad was given pretty much a hero's welcome when he went to Hangzhou last year for the Hangzhou Games. Syria, throughout its history, stood with the Soviet Union, stood with Russia, stood with China, stood with Iran, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with North Korea, with Vietnam, with Nicaragua, against all countries that stood and stand firm against imperialism. So, we've lost a lot with the loss of the Syrian Arab Republic. So again, thank you very much, Sarah. I believe Professor Said Mohammed Marandi has now joined us. I think Professor Marandi really doesn't need much in the way of introduction, but for those of you who don't know, he is a professor of North American Studies. He teaches in the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. And, if anyone's been following the Syria issue over the last couple of weeks, and if they've been following the Palestine issue over the last 14 months, they would certainly have seen Marandi on many shows, both in the camp of the friends and in the camp of the enemies. He always acquits himself extremely well, very powerfully, and very eloquently. So it's an honor to introduce him. Please go ahead, Professor Marandi.
Thank you very much for your kind words. I think everyone here knows exactly what is going on, and there really isn't anything that I can contribute. As you alluded to Libya, I was thinking about how actually the two dirty wars were linked, and again, that's something that you all know. The Timber Sycamore operation was basically using a rat line from Libya initially to Istanbul. And the first time that I came to learn that the war in Syria was a dirty war was actually when I was in Beirut in 2011 and 12 for my sabbatical. In late 2011, I spoke to Alistair Crook, who many of you may have seen in recent months. He's been very active online, and he writes articles for Al Mayadeen website, among other outlets. In late 2011, he told me that the war in Syria is a dirty war. And he explained to me that he was in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and he was in Pakistan and Afghanistan during the dirty war on Afghanistan. And he said that all the people who I knew in Pakistan are now in Istanbul. So the people who are active funding Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the other groups, they had all moved to Istanbul. And of course, we all know what happened since. The recent events have been very painful. I think the last 3 months, especially ever since the onslaught against Lebanon, the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and many Lebanese who were fighting to support the people of Gaza. And then, of course, the Turkish-led attack on Syria with the support of the Israelis and the Americans, that changed the equation. And I think it's fair to say, if we want to be very blunt about it, that Netanyahu, who had been defeated on all fronts, had been able to save himself from defeat. He had lost in Gaza, despite the Holocaust, the genocide. Militarily, he had failed. In Lebanon, as the previous speaker rightly pointed out, he failed to gain any foothold. And of course, Ansarullah in Yemen, they continued to block the Red Sea to the genocidal regime. But most importantly, the Israeli regime, the Zionist regime, was exposed to the world as a genocidal regime. And this really changed the mood across the world. So the regime had lost on all fronts until the resistance was stabbed in the back, and we saw the collapse of Syria. And as was pointed out before me, there's no need to see who is to blame. Right now, that's not going to solve our problems. What needs to happen is to make sure that those who support the resistance across the globe remain motivated and continue to remain active, especially with regards to the ongoing Holocaust in Gaza, but also with regards to what the United States and the Israeli regime are doing in Syria, because the Americans, the Israelis, Qatar, and other regimes, and Erdogan, they have been using different arguments, but especially sectarianism, in order to justify what had happened. But the truth is that I've been to Syria many times, and I think many of our friends have been to Syria often. During the rule of Mr. Assad, it was always clear that he had many supporters, he had many opponents. But when I used to lecture on campus at Damascus University during the 2013, 14, 15, 16, students, some of them liked him, some of them didn't. But no one wanted the extremists that were based or coming in from Turkey. And none of them wanted Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any of their affiliates. That was clear. It was clear as day. And it had nothing, and the students were predominantly, or at least half of the students were Arab Sunni. The rest were Kurdish or Alawite or Christian or Druze. But it was clear that the student body that I had always been interacting with did not want these extremists. But they've been imposed upon them today. And of course, the reason is clear. As the Israelis had always said, they preferred ISIS and Al-Qaeda to the current government, the government in Syria. They want a broken Syria, and the West wants a broken Syria. Not that it's in the interest of the West. In fact, it's contrary to the interests of the West. Regardless of what people may think about Brexit, but if you recall, the refugee flow into Europe, a huge wave took place right before Brexit, and it is fair to say that Brexit was passed because of the fears of refugees in the UK. So whether one supports Brexit or not, the refugees that flow into Europe have changed the political landscape of Europe, and that is not in the interests of the Europeans. And of course, we can give a host of reasons why fragmenting the region, breaking up the region, destroying countries in the region is not in the interests of the United States either. But Europe and the United States sacrifice their interests for the sake of the Israeli regime. That is one of the most extraordinary things that we've seen, but this is something that over the last 14, 15 months now, it has become clear as day. The West has destroyed its image, it's destroyed its credibility, because it's been supporting an ongoing Holocaust. And a Holocaust, the first Holocaust to be carried out in front of the eyes of the world. But they've done this and they've destroyed their credibility for the sake of the Israeli regime. So their interests are subordinate to the regime. And that's why they do not want Israel to thrive, as the previous speaker rightly pointed out. They do not want Syria to grow. But many people, sadly, right now in the region have suddenly been fooled by this narrative. And this is something that we have to work on. We have to constantly expose what the United States is doing. We have to constantly expose what Mr. Erdogan and Netanyahu have done to Syria. And we have to remain optimistic about the future. I think I think we can really say that on the whole, Israel has lost because it has been exposed. I believe that Netanyahu scored a big win in Syria. I think he benefits more than anyone else. I don't believe Turkey benefits. I think that the burden of the broken economy and the rise of extremism is not good for the people of Turkey. It may be good for Mr. Erdogan, who wants to show himself as an Ottoman expansionist, but it's not good for the people of Turkey. But I think that the situation in Syria will evolve. It may take time, but it will not remain as it is. And I believe that as the West further declines because of its perpetual wars, its confrontation with Russia and with China, and because of their own internal economic problems and the divisions in the West, I think it's going to become increasingly difficult for the West to maintain this hegemony. So we should remain patient. We should remain optimistic. I've noticed over the past 2-3 weeks in particular that a lot of people have become depressed. Some have been saying that they want to just move on and get on with their life, I think that's something that we should not even contemplate for a moment. And we should encourage our friends to remain optimistic. I am optimistic about the future, although there's no doubt that these are very dark times, very sad events that we're seeing unfold. And of course, the West is very good at manipulating. Divide and rule has been their policy for centuries, and as the empire dies, they rely more on divide and rule than ever before. But the world is changing. I think if I don't know how many of you have been active, let's say during the previous decade, but if you compare the mood today with regards to Syria and compare it to 2012 and 13, you'll see much more, from my understanding, you'll see much more people understand what's going on than back then. Back then, there were very few voices that were saying that the war in Syria is a dirty war. Very few people believed that the so-called rebels were extremists supported by the empire. A lot of people believed in the white helmets and in the Free Syrian Army, and they believed that Assad was gassing his own people, even though every time the gas attacks were carried out, they were carried out after Syrian Arab Army victory. But now that has changed, and only those who have been fooled by this sectarian rhetoric, or by those who are more naive about Western propaganda, have been convinced that this is a good thing. But many people, unlike a decade ago, their eyes are open and they see clearly what's going on, and I think that itself is very encouraging. So we don't have time for despair, and we have to keep pushing. And I'm sure that in the months ahead, there will be more difficulty. It may get more difficult, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morandi. As always, very insightful, very powerful, and also hopeful. And that was, feels like that's much needed at the moment, that we take a kind of global and a long-term perspective. And this is a really important point as well, that the West is destroying its credibility, not just through supporting a Holocaust in Gaza, which of course is a very important part of it, but also, the whole narrative about our Western values, our European values of democracy and tolerance. That's been the whole narrative of the war on terror for over 20 years, even as they carry out torture in Abu Ghraib, or even as they carry out torture in Guantanamo and many other places. They've told us that they're waging a war on terror, that they're active with wars, proxy wars, destabilisation, sanctions, coercion around the world, in order to spread democracy and spread and stimulate tolerance. But now they're supporting and building contacts with and about to recognize as legitimate an al-Qaeda government in Syria. And they say that, well, we hope it will exercise tolerance, and we hope it will represent all minority communities, and that it will represent the rights of women and so on. Well, you don't really need to speculate that much. You can see what it's done over the past several years in Idlib. They've carried out campaigns of ethnic cleansing against Christians, against Shia, against Alawi, against Druze, against Kurdish, against Yazidi and others. Women have been reduced to a sort of medieval treatment. We accept that as normal in Syria, while bizarrely criticizing Iran for its treatment of women, regardless that Iran is a country where women constitute a majority of students in higher education institutions. Regardless, Iran is a country where women are very well represented in all areas of life and the economy and so on. It's really an extraordinary situation, but it's absolutely the case that the West's credibility is crumbling, and ultimately that's something that has to be welcomed. So we've reached the end of our initial presentations. We've still got 34 minutes remaining in this meeting. I'm going to ask my esteemed friend and colleague Alan Freeman to say a couple of very quick words about money raising and whatnot. Then we'll take some questions and contributions, and then have a round of responses from the panelists. Go ahead, Alan. I can't hear Alan or see him. Okay, I'm going to call Alan in when whatever technical problem has been resolved. In the meantime, I would like to take, ideally, I'd take 3 or 4 questions and contributions. So please use the raise hand function in Zoom if you would like to say something. If you could limit your remarks to a maximum of around 2 minutes so that everyone has an opportunity to get their say and so that the panelists can come back in. The only hand raised I see so far is Lynn Segal. So Radhika, if you could please make Lynn a co-host and then they can come in. And after that, Tassivoulos, and after that, David Katzenberg. Go ahead, Lynn. And
Oh, sorry. You opened the audio. Yeah, so I think I get it all, but why the people in the prisons and killed and gassed and all that? Is that all a fake?
Okay, thanks very much, Lynn. I'll leave that to the panelists to answer.
Would you like me, is it okay if I respond because I have to leave early? If I can just answer
yeah,
the first
of course.
question.
Of course, feel free.
Well, with regards to gas attacks, I think there are a number of people who've done some very good work. And I would refer our friends to the work of Aaron Matei. And I'll just give you one example, and that is the gas attack in Duma, where the OPCW technical staff, they're experts, they're scientists. They went to Syria, actually. This was the first time that they had actually went to Syria to check on what happened. And their scientists went there, and the West had bombed Syria, and they blamed the Syrian government for carrying out gas attacks against its own people. But what happened was that the OPCW scientists, they went there, and they discovered evidence that the gas attack was staged. And for example, the canister that had fallen through the roof, it was manually placed there. And then the OPCW analysts who had gone back to write their report, they were sidelined. And higher up officials, they went and wrote the report. And these whistleblowers were sidelined and they were ignored. But that aside, I think it's important to note that the 3 or 4 occasions where the so-called gas attacks took place, well, they all took place when the Syrian Arab army had the upper hand. And they were carried out under the American threat. The Americans said if the Syrians use gas, they'll bomb Syria. So what incentive would the Syrian army have to use chemical weapons if they're going to be attacked? So the issue of gas is these were false flag operations. But with regards to prisons, there's no doubt that the Syrian state was no utopia, and it was deeply flawed. And I've always said that, and I've always believed that. And in fact, when the unrest began in 2011, there was friction between Syria and Iran, and this is something that is well documented because the Iranians were asking the Syrians to respond in a different manner to the unrest. However, and we have to keep in mind that Iran's entry into Syria, Hezbollah's entry into Syria, was only after 2013. After tens of thousands of foreign fighters had already been brought into Syria from across the world to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. The issue was that Syria, with all its, and I personally believe that President Assad was the best in this Ba'athist system. And he actually had many problems with the party, but they were there before him. They were very powerful. But in any case, I don't want to, Assad has, there are right now many criticisms of him. There are many accusations, and I don't want to go into what happened during the final days of the Syrian state. But what I do want to say is that the issue for, I think, all of us is that whatever the flaws of the Syrian state were, and they were no greater than Saudi Arabia or Egypt or any of these oil-rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf region or Jordan or any, Morocco. It's no worse than them, except for the fact that they supported the Palestinian people and they were insistent on their sovereignty. But whatever the flaws of Syria, they were definitely preferred to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There's no comparison. And as I said, during my experiences in Syria, and I would go to Syria at least 3 times a year during the height of the dirty war, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, I go 3 or 4 times a year. And it was clear to me that people, whatever they thought of the government, they definitely did not want, at least my anecdotal experience told me this, and others were saying the same, that they did not want these terrorists that were being funded by Turkey and Qatar and these oil-rich dictatorships and NATO. If it's okay, I have to go. I'm very grateful to our friends for giving me the opportunity to speak. It was a great honor, and I hope to see all of you sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Professor Morandi. And much as we'd like to keep you our hostage, unfortunately, in the interests of being reasonable and exercising that much vaunted democratic principle, we will let you go this time. But thank you so much for joining us. That was very great presentation, very, very useful response there as well. I'm now going to ask Thrasivolos to come in. Radhika, if you can enable them to speak.
I'm requesting him to unmute. I think he should be. I'm doing that again. Why is it not working? Okay, I'm going to make him co-host briefly. Okay, there you go. Please go ahead. Thrasivolos, please go ahead.
This doesn't seem to happen. So in the meantime, should we allow David Katzenberg to jump the queue?
I'm going to go to David Katzenberg. David, please unmute.
Yes, I think I've unmuted. I'm trying to.
Perfect, and we can hear you.
Hi, Radhika. I'm trying to get my video going here. I guess it won't. Oh, here
Brilliant.
we go. I was going to ask whether or not the guests thought at the end of the day Bashar al-Assad was a good guy, but I'll pass on that because I thought the last answer was very good. What I want to ask is a kind of a counterfactual question, because I like to go back to the roots, the deep roots. I'd like to know what Syria might have been like. Syria, the great, righteous, sacred Syria would be like today had it not been for Sykes-Picot in 1915, 1916. If France had not carved out, greater Syria, Lebanon from Palestine that the British got, along with Iraq, and Syria had been allowed to develop along its natural organic lines. I mean, it's totally counterfactual. Rather than evolving into this familial dynasty, tyrannical dynasty of the Assads, Hafez al-Assad and his son, the ophthalmologist, no matter how badly they've been wronged, it was pretty mutant. I would imagine, I would think a historian would say that the Assads and the Baathists were kind of a mutant expression of what Syria might have evolved into had it been allowed to evolve totally independently in the wake of the First World War. Can somebody comment on this? And thank you so much for organizing this, and especially to you, Radhika.
It's a team effort, but thanks, David. Now I'm going to ask Thrasivoulos to unmute again. Thrasivoulos, can you try? It looks like it's not working. I'm going to make you co-host. This should allow you to speak, Thrasivoulos. So would you please go ahead and place your question? I don't know what's happening. I think the only thing we can request, and I'm sorry it's not working because it's working with everybody else. Maybe you could just put your question in the chat and we will post your question. And since there are no other hands, before we go to the speakers to be able to respond, I'd really like everyone. Of course, I understand that this is a very complex situation, and in many ways, we should all be, weeping buckets of tears and so on as to, the setback that this represents to all the progressive forces in the world. But if you could, perhaps, if all the speakers, and I guess that at the moment only means Sarah, Ali and Baman. But if you could all reflect on the contradictions that are rife for Israel, for the US, and of course also for Turkey, it would be very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Radhika, okay for me to call on the panelists to come back? Okay, great. Ali, if you'd like to go first, and if you could limit your remarks to about 5 minutes, that'd be great.
Okay, that in terms of the contradiction in Syria, going forward, Radhika, that's the question. Yeah, okay. I think the main power in Syria now is Turkey, no doubt about it. But also there is also the US and Israel trying to do dominance. And what we could see is one level of contradiction is between Turkey, who are in their interest that Syria is unified, and that there is no splitting of Syria, and between the US, who wants to carve part of Syria for what is seen by Turkey as a Kurdish state that goes across Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And there is this idea that which is there are many evidence for it that Israel and the US wants to create this client Kurdish state, which is landlocked, so it can only depend on outside powers, and that can pose a threat to the unity and the integrity of these countries. And Turkey sees that very much as a threat to it. So we'll see an increased Turkish-US conflict regarding this Turkish presence in Syria. That's one struggle. The other one is Israel, stupidly and part of their aggressive nature, have gone for occupying a large part of southern Syria. And I mean, it is very stupid policy. The late Nasrallah kept calling Israeli leaders stupid, and they are stupid strategically. And we are already seeing evidence of demonstrations and resistance in southern Syria against this Israeli occupation. Don't forget that the Syria has a history that goes back long time ago for being a very patriotic national state. Don't forget that Salah ad-Din, when he evicted the crusade from Jerusalem, he was the ruler in Syria. So greater Syria and Syrian nationalism is important and it's very big. And that's going to be a dominant force. And that's why we saw the demonstrations in Damascus yesterday, where not only they called, it was big demonstrations actually, not only they called for secular Syria, where all religions and nationalities coexist together, but it is the birth of Syrian patriotic resistance to foreign domination, particularly Israeli domination. Syria was always the heart of the Arab world, and historically it was always Iraq and Syria that dominated the Islamic presence in this big region in West Asia. So I see this big struggle between Turkey and the US well, Israel and the U.S. wants to dismember Syria, and the Syrian people who want Syria united, but they don't want Turkish influence in the same time. So I think these are two dominant forces that will control what happens in the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ali. I mean, very useful remarks. I mean, it's very difficult to predict in a sense what's going to happen in the coming months and years. There's a worst case scenario for Syria, which probably looks similar to the reality of what's happened in Libya over the course of the last 13 years, in terms of becoming a failed state and a state of more or less ongoing civil war where conditions of life have become pretty much intolerable, and all the massive gains that were made during the period of Green Libya under the government of Gaddafi have been lost, more or less. Hopefully a similar fate doesn't await Syria, but it's certainly not impossible that it would. And of course, strategically, in terms of Syria's role in support of Palestine and its position within the axis of resistance, and its role in enabling weapons to flow from Iran through Iraq and then Syria into Lebanon and the West Bank. These are all things that are very much up in the air. But yes, thank you again, Ali. I would now ask Bahman Azad to come in for around 5 minutes.
Yes, Carlos, I can just respond to the question of how Syria would look like without all those things. I just want to say that you don't have to go that far back in history. Just go back to before 2011 and compare Syria prior to the whole project of dismantling it to the years that happened afterwards. I think a brilliant article on Sanctions Kills website by Roberto Rivolta about the economic war against Syria. I recommend everybody to read that article that tells you, puts you a picture, comparative picture before 2011 and after 2011, and that gives you how Syria would have looked like today without those interventions. Thank you. Sarah may be able to explain more about that.
Yeah, many thanks, Bahman. And if someone's able to post a link to that article in the chat, that would be extremely useful. Sarah, are you able to come in?
Yeah, hello. Well, let me try just quickly to address a couple of points. Was there repression in Syria? And is there propaganda about repression? And both are true. Just as there's propaganda about gas attacks. Yes, there were. What on earth would Syria do with tens of thousands of paid mercenary fighters? They weren't executed. Were they imprisoned? Were some of them turned over to the US, to the Turkish forces and whatnot? Were they established a real base? And that was a problem. But really, the talk of prisons is always an effort to make us forget what we know about what US did in Iraq, what Guantanamo is to this day, and every president, Obama, Biden, Trump, everybody said they were going to end Guantanamo. They haven't yet. But we should just remember, because they want us to forget Abu Ghraib, but they especially want us to forget that there are more than 2 million prisoners right here in the US today, the largest prison population in the world, where solitary confinement is used, all different forms of torture are used and have been condemned internationally. So they want to always flip the script, put our attention elsewhere than right here, or what US policy is doing around the world. Every state, by being a state, has a repressive apparatus, but really it also has the potential to be a liberating facility, depending on whose interest it functions for. And in that way, Syria was really a liberating country for its vast mosaic of all different peoples, and giving real space and recognition to the many peoples. It was in complete contradiction to US, British, French imperialist policy, which was to break up and always set one group against another. I'm glad there was mention of Sykes-Picot because it does go all the way back. How could imperialism divide what was the greater Arab nation of the day and a real Arab nationalism? It was an enormous political force. That was the purpose for Zionism. It was a purpose for which Israel was created, was to be a source of endless war and division on all the Arab countries of the region, one after another, a source of war against Egypt and Syria, and of course, always, every minute, against the Palestinians, a source of constant bombing of Lebanon. So we need to look at US policy, which was always to divide the Arab people, and to set one group against another and to use religious differences in the most sinister and cynical way. It's also important to look at the enormous accomplishments still that existed in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, when as a nation state, they were able to solve huge problems of agriculture, of land, of developing oil resources, as Iran has also done. But in Syria, in Iraq, and Libya, the all-out effort to destroy that. Now, they destroyed it in Libya, and French imperialism played such a role, partners with the US in that destruction. And where did it lead to them? French imperialism is all but out of the Sahel, out of Africa. The recognition throughout Africa of imperialism's role flows in great part from Libya. We could see that also in Iraq, and it will be the result in Syria today. So there are contradictions. But I want to say that there is one failed state that we need to consider and always keep in mind. Israel is a failed state by every measure. It exists only on US subsidies, US arms. It's completely divided internally. There's a big Israeli opposition. There are hundreds of thousands of anti-Zionist Israelis now. And there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who simply left, who have no interest in being part of this settler regime. So if we want to talk about failed states kept afloat by imperialism, we got to look at what Israel is today. It exists on subsidy. It exists on being puffed up by US, but the other imperialist powers, and it can't exist that way for very long. Now they've expanded. They say they're going to build a greater Israel. Well, I don't think that's what's in the cards for them or for US imperialism. But let's try not to buy into the propaganda. Every time you hear a line like prisons or gas or this or that, it's important to ask, well, what are they trying to take our attention away from? What's really going on underneath all of this? And that plays an important role, I think, in our world outlook, because it is a global struggle, and we got to take sides on it. We got to take sides in knowing the weapons that they use, propaganda being maybe the most powerful, and economic sanctions that starve countries down so they can't in any way meet the potential or even accomplish what they had before. And divide and rule. Those are the weapons that they use. Divide and rule, making hatred among religious and national groupings, capturing smaller groupings. That is an imperialist tactic. So I think we need to educate ourselves on this and keep in mind that our opponent is US imperialism and all the imperialist forces, the G7, the NATO countries, and so on. And thank you for organizing today's event.
Thank you very much, Sarah. An excellent note to end on. And thank you so much to all the panelists for their insight. I think people will agree it's been a very important and a very worthwhile and interesting session today. This is a discussion that's going to continue. It's a situation that's going to continue to unfold, and we in the IMG will of course be paying a great deal of attention to it in 2025, along with the unfolding situation and shifting situations in Russia, in China, in Latin America, in Africa, and and everywhere around the world, that people are struggling against imperialism and are struggling to forge a multipolar future in which people can determine their own destinies and where they can work together as equals on a global basis towards peace, towards prosperity, and to save the planet. We will have a new series of events starting in January. I think very likely starting with a session on the likely significance of Donald Trump's return to the White House. Do visit the website, internationalmanifesto.org. If you haven't signed the manifesto, please sign the manifesto. I think it's still a very relevant document. Do sign up to the newsletter so that you can stay informed of what we're doing and be alerted to our events. Do donate if you can via Patreon, or I think there's various means of donating. If you're in a position to do so, to help keep this work going. And yeah, all that remains is to say thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you very much for all the participants and the audience members for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon and working with you in the new year.